Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. It's very gratifying to see such a huge crowd. Our topic today is housing. And this is not the first time that UCCS has brought the topic of housing to the policy community. California's housing crisis and our response to it has been a central theme of our speaker series this year, and it will again take up a great deal of our attention next year. Before I go further, I'd like to express our thanks to the California Association of Realtors and the Center for California Real Estate. I see that there are many representatives here, so thank you for being here. Thank you for co-sponsoring this event. For those of you who don't know, this is UC Center Sacramento. We have two fundamental missions. One is to prepare California's future leaders to take up their roles as residents and citizens of our state. The other is to share knowledge that's generated on each of the 10 campuses of the University of California and elsewhere with policymakers in the interest of better, more evidence-based public policy making. So with that, it's a pleasure to introduce our moderator and introducer for today's program. Bernadette Austin is Associate Director of the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis. She has a wealth of experience in housing policy and in fact is a resident of West Sacramento, serves on the Planning Commission in West Sacramento, and has a great deal of experience in both the public and private sector in the housing arena. So she's a graduate of St. Mary's College in California and received her master's degree in policy at UC Davis. So Bernadette, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to the program.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Richard. Thank you all for coming. What I'd like to start with is getting a sense of who is in the room. Please raise your hand if you've worked in some capacity in housing. Lots of housers. Welcome, housers. Please raise your hand if you work right now in some sort of policy advocacy work. Quite a few of you as well. And I also want to mention, too, that the speakers and I will be taking turns standing at this podium for the beginning portion of this. If you are watching from closed circuit TV, can you cheer really loudly so we can hear you? So, yes, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the folks who are participating somewhat remotely. So today we're here to talk about housing. Lots to talk about. So first question, is housing infrastructure or is it a public good? Some of the things we'll be talking about today will seek to address this question. My answer is that it's both, but they both have different implications for policy, decision making, and more. It frames the way that we understand the underlying causes and the potential solutions. So housing is multifaceted and requires a coordinated and complex set of solutions to address these complex problems. So in the academic world, housing research and innovation grows out of multidisciplinary collaborations. This might involve land use or social sciences. It also looks at how interdisciplinary centers like mine and the one that David works for can really bring together experts from a variety of different fields and disciplines. So I'll start with introducing my colleague, David. He and I have extensive experience in both sustainable land use and real estate development prior to our stint in academia. So David is currently the policy director for the Turner Center at UC Berkeley. He leads the center's engagement in local, state, and federal housing policy and supports a generation of research-driven policy ideas, proposals, and papers. One of the ways that he and I originally connected was during his work at 10 Space, which won several awards for their projects from the American Planning Association, from the American Planning Association's Award of Excellence in Urban Design by the California chapter. He also worked at the Government Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. So he's done quite a bit of work. I don't want to overshadow some of these things that he's going to talk about, so I'll allow him to come up here. David, would you like to join us?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bernadette, for the introduction and for inviting me to be here today. Before I get started, we are at the UC Center, so I do want to note that I'm a proud alum of UCLA, so go Bruins. All right. I've been asked to lay out a little bit about what the Turner Center does and how our work actually impacts the conversation around housing policy. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Turner Center for Housing Innovation is a research and policy organization that is housed at UC Berkeley. It's kind of a hybrid center in that we answer to both the College of Environmental Design as well as the Haas School of Business. And so the Turner Center has a stated mission of coming up with innovative solutions to house people in sustainable ways through all walks of life. And so practically what that means is we try to engage in research and policy that is impactful and can impact the conversation around housing today. So we're not a think tank where we come out with ideas and hope that someone picks them up. Our goal is to really come up with policies or recommendations that are going to make a difference now. So for example, some of our work has been very instrumental in some of the conversations we're having today. At the national level, Senator Kamala Harris, who is a presidential candidate, has introduced legislation for a renter's tax credit, which was based somewhat on a work we did a couple years ago on the creation of a tax credit specifically for renters to help those out who are rent burdened. On the local level, or I should say at the state level, several of our bills that are going through the legislature now reference a lot of our Turner Center work. So for example, we've done quite a bit of work on accessory dwelling units with my colleague Karen Chappell, and a number of bills reference the Turner Center work on the need to reduce barriers to facilitate more ADUs, more backyard cottages and things like that. We've also done work on Senate Bill 50, which is Scott Wiener's bill, which you may or may not have heard of, which would dramatically upzone many places in California. So we actually partnered with the Urban Displacement Project to do some work around what are the real impacts of this potential legislation. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of what this may or may not do, and so our goal has, through this research, has really been to look at, what lots would actually be impacted, what communities would be impacted, and how would they be impacted, and how should we approach these very important questions, because this is a very, very important topic, not just in California, but throughout the country. We've also done work on tenant protections as well. So for example, we released a brief last year that was entitled Finding Common Ground, which was our attempt to kind of find some solutions that provided meaningful protection to the state's renters without harming the actual supply or production of new housing. And part of that work has been cited in both Oregon's bill to have an anti-gouge rent cap, as well as a bill that has been introduced in California that would do the same thing. So it was just a little bit of background on work we've done to date, but generally speaking, we have four pillars of our research, and the first is really, it's part of our name, it's innovation. How do we actually do research and put out recommendations that are not just nibbling at the margins, they're going to make a significant impact to how we address our housing crisis. So this includes innovations around regulations, things like zoning, but it also includes innovating how we actually build our homes today. So for example, we've done work on the potential of modular offsite construction. So in other countries, it is quite common for homes to be built in a controlled factory setting and then shipped to their site. Is there a potential to do the same here in California and in the United States? And if so, what are the barriers that we need to overcome to do that? Because if you look at the overall cost to build housing, which is something I think we'll get into later, your biggest cost is the actual hard cost of materials and labor. And if we do smaller things like streamlining and zoning reform, that helps somewhat, and it's important, but we really need to tackle this broader question of why does it cost so much overall to build new homes. We also look at sustainability in housing as well. So to the extent that our housing goals overlap and align with our broader climate goals, we try to incorporate that into our research as well. So another example, about 2 years ago, we partnered with Next 10 and the Berkeley Center for Law and the Environment to look at what are the potential gains in greenhouse gas reductions by having a more infill-focused policy here in California. And then we also do more evaluative work, so program evaluations, We've worked with HCD on some of this work as well. So to the extent that we have existing programs, how are they working? Where are opportunities to improve these programs? So broadly speaking, that is what the Turner Center does, some of the work that we've undertaken. I would also be remiss, as I see a lot of California Association of Realtor members in the room today. We have a partnership with CCRE on a working paper series. We just released, I believe, our second or maybe I think our third paper that looks at our Turner Center land use survey and asks academics from across the country to use this data to examine land use practices in California. So I want to put in a little plug for that. But otherwise, again, I want to thank Bernadette for having me here and for everyone for showing up today. And I look forward to a good discussion.
Well, thank you so much. So my colleague did a good job of highlighting some of the many centers and disciplines that he works with. In a similar way, in academia, we do multidisciplinary work. In California, we're striving to do a better job of working across agencies. So I will mention that, not to get too wonky, but there are a lot of different state agencies in California that have some impact on housing and housing affordability. Just to name a couple, the Treasurer's Office has several units, the Business Consumer Services and Housing Finance Agency, Cali, PA. So many agencies work to determine housing policy and housing affordability. So I am joined by a colleague of mine, Zach Olmsted, who works at the Department of Housing and Community Development, which arguably has the most direct impact. That being said, he has a really broad perspective. So in the same way that David and I share a background in infill development, Zach and I have both worked in policy and advocacy around housing-related issues. So not just has he been working at a state agency, he's also been on the ground. Currently, he's the Deputy Director of Housing Policy and Development at HCD, which is the acronym, he also served as Assistant Deputy Director of Homelessness and Housing Policy. Prior to joining HCD, he was the lead advisor on housing, homelessness, and land use policy to Speaker Emeritus of the California State Assembly, Ms. Toni Atkins, and also fulfilled that role during her tenure as a Speaker of the Assembly. He was the Director for Homeless Policy at Housing California, and he is an alumnus of USD and got his Master's in Public Policy and Administration from Sac State. So please welcome Zach Olmsted.
Thanks, Bernadette. A pleasure to see so many friendly faces in the room. I will do my best to be brief. I know people's interests are varied, and I think we can have a real good discussion and allow for a lot of questions. So I'll do my best to be brief like David was. I will start by saying at HCD, especially in our housing policy division, but certainly department-wide, we have kind of essentially 4 principles that guide us to help make our determination and prioritization of our work. So there are kind of 4 overall policy objectives around which we structure it. The first is ending homelessness. The second is helping to deliver on the state's climate change goals. The third is how do we increase access to opportunity for all Californians through housing policy. And of course, the fourth that undergirds all of those is how do we increase supply for housing at all income levels. I'll spend my comments today mostly talking about what people want to hear about now, which is, what is the governor's plan for housing? He's talked about a lot of different things. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those large-scale things, but certainly we can get to more detail and questions. And luckily, I have a great team at HCD with our housing policy division within our department. We have been very, very pleased to see the governor's focus on housing, have begun to be able to run with some of his proposals, which I'll talk about, and certainly are interested in working on what may come in the state budget. So a lot of what has been proposed, of course, would need to be ratified from a funding perspective in the state budget, but in some cases there's some policy proposals that are a part of that as well. So, there's a lot of stuff when we talk about how do we address housing in the state. There are multiple ways, right? At HCD, we do a lot of direct funding work. Voters passed Prop 1 and 2 last year, for example. There are some federal funds that we administer. There is now a regular source, permanent source from Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins, Senate Bill 2, that was part of the housing package a couple years ago. There's a variety. We have about 20 programs right now of funding streams that we essentially kick out mostly directly to developers to help build housing to deliver on those policy goals that I mentioned. So some are focused on homelessness or special needs populations. Some are focused maybe on co-locating housing near transit. Some are just how do we increase more housing affordable generally. And of course, then there's the policy arm of things, so which is the division I oversee. And so there's a lot that we can do to help promote housing development. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and especially how it plays into the governor's thesis and what he's proposed out there. And the first is something we were already working on. Speaking of collaboration, the governor has proposed that we do a better job of dealing with our excess property at the state level. And it's important to make that determinate distinction between excess property versus surplus property. Surplus property is something that there's a much smaller world of. Excess property is like underutilized property. So the mandate to us and to our partners at the Department of General Services, who are essentially our state's holder of all our real estate, is to really do an intense analysis. Since we are in the middle of that analysis, and we at HCD are coming forth with the determination of which of those parcels are viable for development. So that's actually very exciting. It's a kind of a new line of business for us in terms of how can we better utilize those parcels for affordable housing. And that's something, given that it was an executive order, that we've been able to work on immediately. There's also, of course, all that the governor's proposed around increasing resources for housing. So even building on the billions that were approved by voters in November 2018 from Propositions 1 and 2, that were our bond funds that are, for the most part, being deployed by HCD. He has proposed further funding. The one that comes to us at HCD is this concept of increasing planning grants out to cities and counties, as well as incentive payments on the back end if you can increase housing supply or do activities that help you increase housing supply. So certainly that's a pending item, but what I have heard is generally a lot of support for funding levels at that amount, and really the debate has been around what is the most effective policy levers, right, for the use of those dollars. But the thesis, is this, right? We, in order to get to a much higher production goal, he certainly set a lofty goal, 3.5 million homes. It is a lofty, ambitious goal, but sometimes you need those ambitious goals in order to effectuate change. And you can't get to 3.5 million before you get to 500,000, before you get to, did I mix it up? You have to get to 500,000 first, to 1 million, to 2 million, et cetera, right? And so one of the ways we have to do it is we have to holistically look at the problem. We can't just be building in a handful of places, in a handful of cities, right? And so the idea is like, hey, we'll give you the resources, cities, to do things like change your ordinances, do your zoning that you need to do, whatever it takes, right? But we want this to be seed money to lead to increased production. And so, that could be a number of things when it comes to transparency of the fees that you charge or levy around development. That could be, hey, do the work you need to do from a regulatory standpoint of making sure things can be more by right by development coming for zoning and not be subject to further environmental review. It could be things like, just creating more development certainty generally around your policies. So there's resources there, and then there's the concept of incentive payments on the back end if you can meet that. And I think one thing I'll highlight from that in terms of the work that may come to us is we will have the ability to help define for cities what that means. What does it mean to be housing friendly, right? What kind of policies should you be engaging in to create a better playing field, a more attractive environment for development? Because while it is true that a lot of housing development is market-based, there are definitely things cities and counties can do to make housing easier or harder, more expensive or cheaper. And so that is part of the thesis from the governor's. Like, you don't have to do this alone. We'll bring resources to you, but engage in those policies because we need to collectively get to a higher production goal. I'll just mention briefly, we are, of course, still very much steep in the implementation of a lot of legislation over the last couple of years, right? So once that legislation passes, it comes to us often for writing guidelines, offering technical assistance or guidance. So even 2017, those laws became effect, only 15, 20 months ago. there's still a lot of implementation around that, whether it be stuff that leads to more by right development and those pros, whether it be the funds we're able to put out. And so we at the department are charged with effectively implementing those things. And we're still in the infancy stages, truthfully, of a lot of that stuff, right? A lot of the impacts from legislation in the last couple years affect the planning and zoning process that cities and counties have to go through. Well, we're entering that next planning cycle now, and so those changes we have to help work with communities to help them understand, like, this is what that means when it comes to the housing element that you have to do as part of your general plan, the zoning that you now have to do. And so I'll close with kind of the last piece of that, which is our work around enforcement of these laws, right? A lot of what has transpired in the last couple of years is dealing with that tension of local control versus state control, but it also has significantly changed the consequences for inaction. States, all cities and counties had to do a housing element as part of their general plan. That means they had to zone for their housing need. And many were doing that, but there weren't very many consequences for failure to do so. Certainly you could get sued by a third party, but now it is tied to your ability to access the bond funds that were passed last fall, right? So if you do not have a valid housing element, if you're not submitting your annual reports to say how you're doing the progress of meeting those goals, there are consequences, right? And so also kind of right out the gate, the governor agreed that we should make sure that we're holding all of California's to the same standards, right? So, the state sued Huntington Beach for its failure to deliver on the promises of its housing element. The governor then had a couple summits with the mayors of the 47 cities throughout the state. And I should say 47 cities out of our 539 or 5 jurisdictions is not a huge percentage, but I think the thesis behind that is everyone must be doing the bare minimum of this zoning for their land, right? And then we can talk about what it means to build on that zoning. But he held 2 summits, and that, was very, very invigorating, I think, for me and all the staff, some of which are in this room, to really help us work with cities, help them, right, get to where they need to be, provide that assistance, but also that message that, hey, if you're not going to get there, there potentially are going to be further consequences down the road. So that is another major part of our work, which certainly we were given that authority from bills passed just 2 years ago and are now acting on that authority and finding that balance in terms of helping cities and counties deliver on those best practices, those housing-friendly policies, do their zoning or housing elements, but then at the right point saying, hey, everyone's in this together and there are some consequences for that action. So that is certainly the comprehensive look, so to speak, of what is currently out there, not to mention probably the biggest volume of pending legislation that we've even seen following the delivery of a lot of significant policy change that is, like I said, still in its infancy. So it's a really exciting time to be having this discussion. And I imagine you guys will have questions on a number of those pieces. So I'll stop there because I think it would be most engaging probably to allow for some of that discussion that Bernadette can shepherd. So thank you very much, and look forward to your questions.
Test, test. As we move into the question and answer portion of today, I would like to do a piece of housekeeping and also would like to respectfully request that your questions, in the interest of time, are not a monologue and listed and limited to maybe 1 or 2 sentences and truly be a question rather than a statement. Okay, so I appreciate that in advance. If you could raise your hand if you're going to be one of the runners. So I'm going to start with 2 questions of my own. But if you want to stand and kind of show where you're going to be located, so. Flag down either of these 2 individuals if you have questions, and the questions will start after I have my first 2 questions. So let's start with the both most straightforward and most complicated question. Why is housing so expensive, and what can policymakers do to help address mitigating these costs? And so if you want to each take about 2 or 3 minutes.
That's it?
That's it, yeah.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
Dissertation, yeah.
No, I think this is the most pressing question that anyone who is even not involved in housing at all has this on their mind, because 50% of our state's renters are considered rent burdened in that they pay more than 30% of their income towards rent, and of that, another 1.7 million are severely rent burdened. They pay more than 50% of their income on rent. We also have the lowest levels of home ownership in California since the 1940s. So it's a serious question that impacts everyone in California. So whenever I'm asked this, I kind of the first question is, why are we in this housing crisis? And the most top-level, straightforward answer that I like to give is that we simply have stopped building the amount of housing that we need necessary to house everyone who wants to, needs to live in California. I think we sometimes think, over the last 7-8 years, we've seen a building boom, and we certainly have compared to, the last, since the 2000s. We see in the Bay Area especially, a lot of cranes everywhere. People say we're building a lot, this is great. Or it's not great, depending on your opinion. But the reality is, when you look at what we're building today versus what we built in the state in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we're building a fraction of that. So this past year, we built about 100,000 new units in California. But HCD says we need 180,000 units a year just to keep up with demand. And if you look at what we built in the decades prior, we were building upwards of 250,000 units per year, sometimes as much as 300,000 units. So at the top level, we are simply not keeping pace with demand by building new homes. And this is new homes across the spectrum of needs, both market rate units, affordable housing, deed restricted, things like that. We just haven't built enough. And so the next question is, well, why have we not built enough? And so part of that reason is that it costs a lot to build. I mentioned this earlier, but in the Bay Area, it costs upwards of many times $800,000 per unit to build one affordable housing home. And so we have a lot of new money coming from the legislature, from propositions, but to the extent that costs keep rising, that money becomes less and less efficient, and we won't actually be able to build enough affordable homes. On the private side, it's hard to build homes that are affordable to anyone but the top end of the income spectrum, because the costs to build these homes are so high. To justify that, you have to charge pretty high rents. And so that's a problem. That wasn't always the case. Developers used to be able to deliver housing that was affordable to middle income individuals, but because of the costs and other factors, it's no longer true anymore. And part of that is also, last point, is where we're allowed to build. We've done some research on this. Issy Roman, one of our Turner Center fellows, who is also chief economist at Julia, he looked at where we're actually building in not just California, but metro areas across the country. And uniformly, he sees that we're building in two places. We're building densely in urban cores, and we're building single-family homes far away from our urban cores. And virtually nothing is being built in between those places. So to the extent that we can think about what we're allowed to build and how we build it, I think that's the key to solving this crisis.
Thank you for that perspective. Thank you for that perspective. So, Zach, how are you going to fix it?
Let me just add. Yeah, well, let me add. Let me add. I mean, because your question is, what policies are we effectuating, right? So some of the policies already in place, which, like I said, are still information in terms of like results, right? Are really trying to get at one of the cost drivers, right? Is the length of time it takes to build. So to what degree can we speed up that process and create more development certainty? So many bills passed and being contemplated right now seek to do that by increasing the number of sites that may be developable by right, meaning without, like, as a ministerial or non-discretionary action at the local level. So that is tremendous, actually, potentially, in reducing cost, right? If developers know they're a fixed time in terms of, my permit's going to get approved in this time frame that's now more constrained in statute, and those sorts of things, then you can help bring down costs. Now, it's not certainly the silver bullet of everything, but in terms of what policies are being enacted, what's being proposed, that's one side of the coin in terms of making development certainty a much stronger component, right? And so, just allow more time for questions. I think one of the other challenges of why things take so long to build is community opposition, frankly, at all income levels, but certainly at the affordable housing side of things. We can certainly talk about CEQA and regulatory actions, and I'm sure we will, but truthfully, I think more housing gets stopped because of community opposition that just kills projects before they even start at the local level. So I think we need to take a hard look at ourselves and our friends and our families and say, like, hey, once I move into a place, other people should be able to live here too. And, a lot of the policies that are being either enacted right now, or when I talk about increasing access to opportunity, it's making sure that the people who work in communities can live in them and have access to those amenities and those resources. So we have to really think about, if we care about housing affordability, being on the side at the city council hearing against all the opposition, right? that says, no more building in our city or my community. And also be saying, actually, no, we do need that. We need to have diverse, vibrant communities. We need to make sure people aren't commuting great distances if we care about climate. We need to make sure if we want our kids to do well in school that, that they can live in their school, all that sort of stuff. So I'll just add those things because we probably don't have a ton of time, but I think those are some big drivers.
Thank you very much. So I'll have one more question, and then if my runners prepare for their first speaker, I'll start on my left and then move to my right, which is the mirror for you all. So we've talked a lot about development-related solutions. One of the hot topics out there that's up for debate is tenant-based solutions to addressing housing. So I'd like to hear both of your perspectives on what are the benefits and drawbacks of a variety of tenant-based solutions to this housing crisis.
Sure. So this goes back to some of the work we did last year through our rent control brief, is because during the conversations around what ended up being Proposition 10, those debates were quite polarized in that you were either 100% for rent control, it's the only solution to the housing crisis, or you're the opposite side and that rent control is going to obliterate all the housing in California. And the truth is honestly somewhere in the middle. The literature is not great on this topic, to be quite honest. If you look at the literature on rent control, it's universally pretty much negative as far as the supply impacts. But much of that literature focuses on more hard or first or second generation rent controls, which are not necessarily the kind of controls we have in California. That being said, the work that has been done in California, it's a mixed bag. You probably saw the San Francisco analysis that examined the impacts of rent control in that city over a number of years, and that showed that it did decrease supply and increase rents by a not insignificant amount. On the other hand, it also showed that the individuals who actually had rent control in those cases, they exhibited more stability, particularly those groups who are people of color. And so there's a bit of a mixed bag there. But that being said, our goal has always been to try and thread the needle to say it is not necessarily either or, right? Zero rent control or 100% rent control. It is finding the balance of how can we provide meaningful protection to our most vulnerable populations in California without derailing our broader long-term solution of actually building enough homes and keeping the supply to a level that can house everyone here in California that needs to. So that has always been our approach to this very challenging issue. And I think there are a number of other bills that deal with this exact point. But I will say on a kind of a policy level, we are looking at, as Zach mentioned, a significant amount of new legislation this year, and the governor's made it clear that he wants a package, right? He wants more incentives for building more homes, he wants more money, but he also wants some meaningful protections included in that too. So I think to the extent that we can look broadly across every facet of housing, I think we can build support for a package of bills that will help us get to our goal of 3.5 million homes, but also help protect people today.
Great, thank you. It was one of the best articulated responses I've ever heard.
I get asked that question a lot.
And you're up,
I get a
Zach.
lot
Well,
of
then I'll listen. No, I'll just add a couple things. While most of the debate centers around the high-profile, aspects of rent control, rent stabilization, I think there are a number of other interventions that are, some of which are being proposed, that should not be forgotten in this, right? So one thing is not being able to discriminate based on source of income. So people are voucher holders. You may hear what Section 8 is, right? Like some states have begun to promote policies, and there's currently stuff being deliberated, policy being deliberated around not essentially being able to discriminate a tenant based on their source of income, meaning having that voucher. That is, I think, an important piece of making sure we're capitalizing on all these resources that we have, and people being able to find places in the community. I think another thing that personally is intriguing to me, and is certainly, I think, a really helpful renter protection, is making sure folks in eviction proceedings can have legal representation, right, from legal services. So the data is pretty clear that landlords win in landlord-tenant court about 90% of the time, and they almost always have legal representation, and almost always the tenants do not. And when the tenants do have legal representation, that significantly changes the results of those proceedings. So that's like it's a simple thing. Obviously it takes some resources to potentially promote, but also not not as controversial, right, as maybe full-scale rent control or rent stabilization policies. So I think the reason why I mention them is because there's a number of things. It's not just, okay, this is the only way we can help protect renters. There are a number of things out there, just like with anything, that should be considered.
Thank you. I really appreciate that perspective of toolbox. So if we'll start over here with your question, and then do you have your person selected to go up next? Okay, great. Let's hear from over here.
Hi, I have a question about the way this debate, there is no debate actually, that's my question. This is the University of California. I expect a balanced presentation on the issues. Speakers have made it clear we're dealing with real controversy. There's only one side being presented here, which is the market-based supply-side approach. There are scholars at UC campuses who question that. Why isn't there a balanced discussion here with people from both sides of the debate? Thank you.
So I should maybe clarify, when I talk about supply, I don't mean simply all market rate housing. I think it's quite clear that the market will never be able to provide housing to individuals at the lowest ends of the income spectrum. And so when I talk about expanding supply, and I think I mentioned this in some of my earlier comments, that's really supply across the spectrum with particular attention to supportive housing and deed restrictive housing as well. So it is not as simple as if we just let market rate developers build as much as they wanted, we would get to the affordability levels we've wanted. That's never really been true. And so just to clarify, when I talk about supply, I mean it broadly. So things like expanding the low-income housing tax credit, doing things at the local level, like different affordable housing bonds, those are all incredibly necessary to make sure we can also build housing to populations that are the most at risk and cannot afford new apartments or even apartments that were built 10, 15 years ago.
There's nobody here representing the community who supposedly are pushing back against it.
And so what I'll say is I'd be happy to give you my contact information and follow up to do a future panel as well, because my center is absolutely, the work of our center is absolutely centered on social justice. So I'd be happy to engage a broader conversation with additional speakers. So let's move over here.
Hi. Hi, Bernadette. First, a comment. I'm going to comment on the previous speaker. I do think it is important what one of the things she said, which is that when you look at the marketplace, each city's own data shows that on the rental side, where we're short, only 2% of that is actually above 80% AMI. 2. Everything else is for households below 80% in terms of where we talk about the market is failing. So this idea that we have widespread market failure and we need to focus all across the board, one who's looking to solutions might actually say we should really start where the biggest need is. My question for David is whether the Turner Center has done research looking at the building cost side of it. It was one of the second thing that you cited as the reason we have high housing costs in the state. And I'm curious how much you have unpacked that and looked at labor, looked at materials, looked at land cost, and what you might be able to share around that piece of it for those of us who are really looking to reduce building costs in the state.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to your first point, I would say the majority building now is at the market rate side. And that being said, I don't know the RENA numbers themselves. If we met our RENA number, that means we built enough housing. There's a lot of discussion around if RENA is even the right metric for that. So I could certainly appreciate the need to focus specifically on areas where we have not seen the amount of production necessary, particularly for individuals who are at the highest risk. But I don't necessarily see it as either or, and I think that's part of this whole discussion of a housing package, right? We want to have funding for deed-restricted housing. We want to have real solutions for our homelessness challenge, but we also want to tackle things like exclusionary zoning, things like that. So I don't know that they necessarily one needs to follow the other. They can both, be priorities. So to your question about the cost of construction, this is actually something we have studied pretty significantly at the Turner Center. So we have looked at data provided by the low-income housing tax credit. We actually have a report coming out later this month that looks at the costs over the last 10 years for 9% low-income housing tax credit projects. We have 560 projects, and we're able to isolate by region and by category. That being said, the data itself is not that granular. We can't break it down specifically to the cost of concrete and the cost of different types of facades or what have you. But it does allow us to see where the costs are really rising, and they're rising pretty significantly statewide, but where you're really seeing the spike in cost is in the Bay Area, where the cost per square foot is something like $700 to $800. And I think that is a bit of a function of how densely one has to build in the Bay Area versus some of the other regions of the state. Your projects maybe don't have to have the same construction type. They don't need to go on podium. They can be type 5, which is kind of a less expensive way to build housing. So we're trying to examine that. Don't have an answer for you yet. I would say on top of the work we are doing examining specifically light tech projects, we're looking broadly at construction costs across the sector. And so that's work that is ongoing. It's more of a longer term project. We've collected, I think, over 300 cost sheets from developers, both market rate and affordable, to try and get that level of granularity so we can say across however many years, these have been the real cost drivers and to help identify policy solutions for those issues.
Thank you so much. Do we have a question on the right side of the room? Or
Yeah.
okay, great,
Hi.
thank you.
Parsham with the UC Student Association. So one of the things that we've seen at the student level is really also a student housing crisis, and so that's kind of, especially in the recent years with the legislature mandates of admissions increase on a quick and short turnaround has kind of exacerbated this crisis where the universities are trying to figure out where to house the students. Some of them are kind of changing the already existing room setups from doubles to triples and quads, and so we're seeing quality of housing going down. I'm curious to see if there's any research or policy options that are out there as far as research on what the impact has been, and also policy solutions was what could be done on the short term and more long term to address this crisis.
That's a great question. So I think it'll be mostly a question for David, but Zach, do you want to weigh in on any student housing or any perspective that the state might have on
Are we
that?
talking about on-campus housing?
He's asking about on campus, but I think it's worth if you would like to share.
I mean, obviously, we don't have a
limitations.
role on-campus
Right.
dormitory housing, but it certainly is it's something that in some communities that may have a high student population that we would take into account, for example, when looking at a local jurisdiction's housing need, right? In terms of like, that's a type of population that may impact what the right type of housing or right amount of housing that should be planned for.
Yeah, and what I might add before David provides a response is that when we talk about one of the major financing tools for affordable housing, it can't be used for student housing. So that may be one of those gap areas that needs to be looked at. So David, do you have any perspective on
That's
that?
a really good question, and one that we see the impacts of at UC Berkeley very, very acutely. And the research that I have seen on this, and to be fair, the Turner Center hasn't done any specific research, but what I have seen is that at UC Berkeley, there's something like 10% of students who have at some point experienced some form of homelessness, which is a significant amount of students when you're talking about a campus with 50,000 people. We have faculty members at the Turner Center who have students who are homeless. They live in their cars, they shower in the gym, and that's unacceptable. And so part of the solution is obviously the university, I think, needs to understand what these challenges are and provide housing for these students and outside of traditional forms of housing as well, because like regular developers, if the university is building this, it's also very expensive. And so the actual cost to live on campus is very expensive. And that's to the extent that we want to have a university system that's reflective of everyone in California, we need to provide housing options for students at various income levels as well. The legislature has paid some attention to this. I believe Senator Nancy Skinner authored a bill that revised the density bonus to allow for the creation of on-site affordable units specifically for students. And so I think that there is some attention being paid to that, but there should be more, in my opinion, having seen this firsthand at UC Berkeley.
And what I might end with is that this might be a really great opportunity for UC Student Association to work with the California State University system and other colleges, because certainly many of our universities, almost by definition, are located in high-cost housing areas. So let's move over here, and then if you want to give her the mic next. Yes, sir.
My name's Jeff Tartagia, and I've been a public advocate for a while. We are 10 years behind in housing, and it takes 5 years for any form of affordable housing. I am interested in the Taisumi wave coming up and the fact that the under $1,000 recipient being able to be housed. So it's affordable, it's accessible housing. And the other question I would ask about is transit development, orientation, the incentives, problems with that. Where do we find them?
Wonderful, thanks. Zach, do you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, and so maybe I should provide a little more background. Like all the programs that we, for the most part, at HCD fund are at the lower income levels, so 60% or below area median income, but even more deeply targeted when it comes to homelessness or extremely low income households. At like 30% below, or people making under $1,000 a month, right? And so the way that we do that from a policy perspective, this is really getting kind of in the granularity, is in our program scoring and guidelines, we drive the funding, the best scoring projects are the ones that serve the deepest affordability, right? So if you were serving extremely low income households, you are going to be, all things else other considered equal, more advantaged than one that is serving people at higher income levels. So that is something that we put within our program guidelines, even within our like bread and butter multifamily housing program, which is like the tip, the one that's most often paired with low income housing tax credits, right? If you have a percentage of your developments that are serving those other policy needs, right, serving people at extremely low income levels, co-located near transit, things like that, increasing access to opportunity, things like those types of goals, then you're going to score better, and these are very competitive programs. And so we build those in functionally to the actual program guidelines and the program score.
Great, thank you. Do you want to add to that?
Just one thing to your point about transit-oriented development. I think we're starting to do that better than we have before in California. We have the Los Angeles TOC program, which is their program that basically provides offsets and incentives for developers to build around transit if they also include affordability on site. That's working incredibly well. We actually just released a case study with the help of HCD that examines the success of this program. So that's been encouraging. One thing that I think gets missed in this discussion of transit-oriented development is we always talk about how tall the buildings are. Should it be 10 stories? Should it be 20 stories? Should we cap it at 5 stories? And that actually misses a pretty important opportunity to talk about building quote-unquote missing middle housing, which are things like duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings that are in many cases illegal because of zoning today, but could provide reasonably affordable units because they are built for much less than something that is tall is built for. So you don't need elevators, you don't need concrete. You can deliver these products at a lower price point. And because 70% of our land in California allows for single-family home zoning, is there an opportunity to use some of that capacity to allow slight increases in density to increase the supply outside of this kind of tension between building super densely in urban centers and very low density in suburban places?
Can I add
thank
one
you.
more thing?
Yes.
Sorry. So I don't think one thing that this goes back to even the infrastructure versus public good and also the cost of housing question. I don't think we do a good enough job in the housing community of explaining what we're talking about when we're talking about affordable housing being deed restricted for 55 years and the upfront cost of that. So yes, $500,000 per unit, but you're going to serve multiple households. That's over the course of that deed restriction. And when I say deed restriction, I mean it's keeping that rent at affordable levels. And so that benefit to the community, we're not talking about the number of households we serve for that investment. Right. We're not talking about large units maybe being affordable to, which is really a big gap, right, in terms of for large families. We're not talking about, we often talk about number, units rather than the number of bedrooms. And there's a number of things in the policy debate that we don't do a good enough job of explaining how many people are served by this public good over time. And so, conservatively, you're serving multiple households over the course of that deed restriction. And so that upfront investment, if you think about it as infrastructure, is more justified, right, when you think about the benefit long term.
That's an excellent perspective. Just to manage expectations, we'll take one question here, and you'll be the last question. And so, yeah.
Thank you very much. This is a great panel, and I won't start a fight, but I am from the University of Southern California.
We won't hold it against us.
Okay, I just
Pretend
have
I
Some of
didn't
my
hear
best
that.
friends are Trojans.
I just have two quick questions. My research includes looking at choice neighborhoods, and I'm wondering two things. Number one, when the state of California local governments are looking at redeveloping public housing, what type of funding packages are available for cities that want to engage in that level of planning, given that choice neighborhoods is no longer on the table? And number two, do you guys believe the government, the federal government that is, has any intention to re-examine how the BAH allowance is applied for for military personnel that are coming back and they need housing and want to live in the state of California, but only have a basic housing allowance that can cover certain geographies? Do you think there's any way for our state to innovate around that to make sure our veterans have housing too?
Great, thank you for your question. Zach, do you want to tackle some of those? Without getting into a fight, it's okay. He's a
On the
unbiased
last-
third party.
On the last one, I mean, I haven't heard any proposals
Yeah.
like that. I mean, I did last year get invited to a conference that was military focused, and so there are the germinations of some of those debates happening, but I am not aware of any proposals currently around that. And then on the first question, certainly a lot of the resources we put out to cities and counties could be used in that way. We currently have on the streets planning grant dollars from Senate Bill 2, which was the permanent source bill, and the first year funds, half of which had to be used for planning grants. Certainly doing specific plans around neighborhoods, to create affordability would be something we would say is a really good idea with those planning grants. So there are some resources cities and counties are getting. The governor certainly proposed more that could be used on the planning side of that, and then certainly on the development side of such a thing, that you could with a developer apply from any number of the resources now available at the state level if you were doing affordable housing that met the goals of that program.
Just to your second question, unfortunately, I would say because of the atmosphere in Washington right now, that any policy that might actually alleviate any issues in California is probably going to be difficult to get through, to say the least. That being said, if California wanted to look at this issue, there could be a program to perhaps match that gap between what is available federally, but what is the actual cost here. But to Zach's point, I don't know that has been actually raised to the point of getting it written into legislation yet. That being said, very important issue.
Great, thank you, and we'll have our last question here. If you need to excuse yourself, please do so in the back. Folks have done a great job so far, and the panelists and I will be available for a few questions after the official portion of this ends.
Breaking your rules a little bit, to the person who in the back who was speaking about student housing, there are 2 bills pending in the legislature right now that would change the definition of school facilities such that it would accommodate for the construction, so that you could access bond funding for school facility bond funding. And those 2 bills are addressing the need for housing, whether it's for faculty, staff, or for students. So there's opportunities right now pending in the legislature to address this issue from a funding perspective. But that's my question is a little bit different. I've heard anecdotally, and I haven't seen the evidence yet, but I've heard quite a few stories around the state where local governments are tacking on these incredible fees towards construction of housing. And just for instance, I understood that in Long Beach, I believe the community was, where there's like an aviation museum that needs to go into town, and so that the cost of that museum is being tacked on to new construction. And so I'm just wondering if we can get any information or insights around what we're hearing around the state from local governments and how they're making housing unaffordable through some of their special projects.
Great, thank you. David, do you want to take that first?
We were just talking about fees before this panel started. So the issue of impact fees is something that we've examined before at Turner Center. We actually did a report last year examining a handful of cities, what they charge in impact fees, what they charge them for, and what the impacts may or may not be on housing. So I would refer you to that report. But broadly speaking, cities are given wide authority to charge development fees on any form of housing or construction based on the Mitigation Fee Act, which is a legislation that basically says cities, you have broad authority to determine what an impact is, and you are allowed to pass that on in the form of a fee to new development. And some cities take full advantage of that. So, for example, the city of Fremont, in our analysis, charged about $80,000 per unit for multifamily housing. But some cities are far less than that. So the city of Sacramento, I believe, is less than $20,000, if I remember the report correctly. So it varies widely from place to place. That being said, if you speak to the cities, they'll tell you we need these fees to pay for critical infrastructure. I don't know if a museum meets the definition of critical infrastructure, but under the Mitigation Fee Act, they kind of have the authority to do that. So there was actually a bill last year in the session from Assemblymember Grayson that authorized HCD to do a report on fees. We were contracted with HCD to do a piece of that work, and so that is supposed to be delivered to the legislature in June. We'll have a much more kind of in-depth analysis on what cities are charging in fees, but also kind of how they're administering fees. Is this information available online? Can you access it early in the development process to get some certainty? All of that is being examined as part of this research.
Please join me in thanking Zach Olmsted and David Garcia for a great panel today. Richard, do you want to say any remarks on behalf of the UC Center Sacramento?
Just to thank all three panelists and to thank our audience for a very fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much.